When my mother-in-law looked at my newborn daughter and said, "That thing isn't family," I smiled and handed her an envelope. What happened next destroyed her perfect reputation and changed everything forever. My name is Charlotte, and I'm about to tell you how one DNA test brought down the most manipulative woman I've ever known. But before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you've ever dealt with a toxic mother-in-law, and subscribe because this story will show you exactly how karma works when you have the patience to wait for it. 3 years ago, I was living what most people would consider a fairy tale life. My husband David and I owned a stunning Mediterranean-style mansion in Malibu, complete with infinity pools, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean. David was a successful tech entrepreneur, and his family's wealth went back generations. The Rodriguez family name opened doors that most people could only dream of walking through. I had met David at a charity gala in Beverly Hills. I was working as a pediatric nurse at Cedars-Sinai, having just finished my master's degree in nursing administration. David approached me during the silent auction, charmed by my passion for helping children rather than my designer dress or jewelry. What started as a conversation about the children's hospital wing we were fundraising for became a whirlwind romance that led to our engagement within 8 months. The wedding was everything you'd see in luxury magazines. A clifftop ceremony in Big Sur with 300 guests, a reception that cost more than most people's houses, and a honeymoon in the French Riviera that lasted 3 weeks. I thought I was marrying into not just wealth, but a loving family that would embrace me as their own. I couldn't have been more wrong. David's mother, Victoria Rodriguez, was the epitome of old money elegance. She carried herself like royalty, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had connections to every influential family on the West Coast. Her husband, David's father Roberto, had built a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions. Victoria had never worked a day in her life, but she ruled their social circle with an iron fist disguised in Chanel suits and perfect pearl necklaces. From the moment David introduced us, Victoria made it clear that I wasn't good enough for her son. She would make subtle comments about my modest background and how interesting it was that David was dating someone who actually had to work for a living. During our engagement dinner at their Bel Air estate, she asked me directly if I had signed a prenuptial agreement yet, suggesting that David's lawyer should draft something comprehensive to protect the family assets. The wedding planning became a battlefield. Victoria insisted on controlling every detail, from the guest list to the menu, always reminding me that the Rodriguez family had a reputation to maintain. She would make changes to arrangements I had already finalized, telling vendors that as the mother of the groom, her preferences took priority over mine. When I tried to include some of my own family traditions, she dismissed them as quaint, but ultimately inappropriate for such an important event. David, unfortunately, was completely blind to his mother's manipulative behavior. He had been raised to never question her judgment, and he genuinely believed she was trying to help us have the perfect wedding. When I tried to explain how his mother was undermining me, he would say things like, "That's just how she shows love," or "She wants everything to be perfect for us." His inability to see the situation clearly became our first major relationship challenge. The real problems began after we returned from our honeymoon. Victoria had keys to our house, a gift from David that I hadn't been consulted about. She would arrive unannounced, rearrange our furniture, and leave notes about how the housekeeping could be improved. She criticized everything from my cooking to my choice of artwork, always framing her complaints as helpful suggestions. When I started working part-time at a private practice to maintain my nursing career, she made pointed comments about wives who couldn't commit fully to supporting their husbands. But nothing prepared me for her reaction when I became pregnant. David and I had been trying for a baby for almost a year when the pregnancy test finally showed 2 pink lines. We were overjoyed, especially since we had started to worry that there might be fertility issues. I surprised David with the news by having a custom onesie made that said, baby Rodriguez arriving spring 2024 and leaving it on his pillow. His reaction was everything I had dreamed of: pure joy, tears of happiness, and immediate plans for converting the guest room into a nursery. When we told his parents over dinner at their country club, Roberto was genuinely thrilled. He talked about teaching his grandchild to play golf and taking family trips to their vacation home in Aspen. But Victoria's reaction was strangely muted. She smiled and said all the right words, but there was something cold in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. As my pregnancy progressed, Victoria's behavior became increasingly strange. She would make comments about how some babies look nothing like their fathers, especially when the mother has strong genes. She questioned whether I was really ready for motherhood, suggesting that my career ambitions might interfere with proper child-rearing. Most disturbing was her obsession with genetics and family resemblance. During my baby shower, which Victoria had insisted on hosting at her Beverly Hills mansion, she made several pointed comments to the other guests about how we would have to wait and see who the baby would resemble. When my own mother mentioned how excited she was to meet her first grandchild, Victoria responded that bloodlines often skip generations and that appearances could be deceiving. The comments became more frequent and more specific as my due date approached. Victoria would study family photos with David, pointing out Rodriguez's family traits and expressing hope that the baby would clearly belong to their lineage. She brought up stories of family friends whose children looked nothing like their supposed fathers, always with a meaningful glance in my direction. I started to realize that Victoria suspected I had been unfaithful to David. The accusation was so outrageous that I initially dismissed it as pregnancy paranoia on my part. But Victoria's behavior continued to escalate. She made appointments with her own obstetrician, claiming she wanted to ensure I was receiving proper care, but really trying to access my medical records. She asked David pointed questions about my daily schedule and whether he was certain about the baby's conception date. When our daughter Emma was born on a beautiful April morning, my world changed completely. She was perfect 8 pounds, 2 ounces of pure miracle with David's dark hair and what appeared to be his strong jawline. David cried when he held her for the first time, whispering about how beautiful she was and how much he already loved her. But Victoria's first words when she walked into the hospital room still echo in my mind 3 years later. She looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully in my arms, and said with ice-cold certainty, "That thing doesn't look like a Rodriguez. Are you sure it's David's?" The room went completely silent. David's face went pale. My parents looked shocked, and I felt like I had been slapped. Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I've been concerned about this throughout the pregnancy. The timing never seemed quite right, and now looking at her, I don't see any family resemblance whatsoever." She turned to David, her expression shifting to one of maternal concern. "Darling, I think you need to consider the possibility that Charlotte has been deceiving you. This child doesn't belong in our family, and I won't pretend otherwise just to spare her feelings." What happened next changed everything between us forever. I looked Victoria directly in the eyes, reached into my hospital bag, and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside was something I had been carrying for months, waiting for exactly this moment. My voice was calm and steady as I spoke. "Victoria, before you say another word, I think you should read this." David looked confused as I handed his mother the envelope. "Charlotte, what is this?" he asked. "It's something your mother is going to find very interesting," I replied, never taking my eyes off Victoria's face. As she opened the envelope and began reading, I watched her expression change from smugness to confusion to absolute horror. The paper in her hands was a DNA test result, but not the kind she was expecting. You see, I had suspected for months that Victoria's obsession with genetics and family resemblance was projection. Her constant comments about bloodlines and her paranoia about Emma's paternity had made me curious about her own secrets. During one of her unannounced visits to our house, she had left a coffee cup on the kitchen counter. I saved it. I also had access to Roberto's DNA, through a glass he had used during a family dinner. With my medical background, I knew exactly how to preserve the samples and which laboratory to use for the most accurate testing. The results in Victoria's trembling hands proved that Roberto Rodriguez was not David's biological father. Victoria Rodriguez, the woman who had built her entire identity around the purity of the Rodriguez bloodline, had been living a lie for 35 years. The man she had been married to, who had provided her with wealth, status, and social position, was not the father of her only child. "This is impossible," she whispered, her face draining of all color. "The accuracy rate is 99.9%, I replied calmly. "Would you like me to explain how DNA testing works, or shall we discuss why you've been so concerned about Emma's legitimacy?" David grabbed the paper from his mother's hands, his eyes scanning the results.
"Mom, what is this?"
What does this mean? Victoria's carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. "Charlotte, how dare you invade our privacy like this? This is illegal. This is exactly what you were planning to do to my daughter," I interrupted. "You've been questioning her legitimacy since the moment you knew I was pregnant. You've made accusations about my faithfulness and suggested that Emma doesn't belong in this family. I thought it was time to examine your own qualifications for making such judgments." Roberto, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned around with confusion written across his face. "Victoria, what is she talking about? What test results?" The room temperature seemed to drop as the full implications of the situation became clear. Victoria Rodriguez, the matriarch of one of California's most prominent families, had been exposed as an adulteress who had deceived her husband and built her entire life on a foundation of lies. But this was only the beginning of her downfall. Over the next few weeks, I carefully orchestrated the release of information that would destroy Victoria's reputation in the social circles she valued above everything else. I started with her closest friends, the women she played tennis with at the country club and gossiped with over champagne brunches in Beverly Hills. I didn't have to lie or exaggerate. The truth was damaging enough. During a charity luncheon at the Peninsula Hotel, I casually mentioned to Patricia Whitman, Victoria's best friend and the biggest gossip in their social circle, that our family had recently discovered some surprising information about David's genetics through Emma's birth. When Patricia pressed for details, I explained that we had learned David's biological father wasn't who we had always believed. Patricia's eyes lit up with the kind of scandalous delight that wealthy women live for. Within hours, the story was spreading through Beverly Hills like wildfire, each retelling adding new dramatic details. I made sure to be present at several social events during this period, playing the role of the confused and slightly hurt daughter-in-law who was just trying to understand her family's complicated history. When other women approached me with questions, I would express my genuine bewilderment about Victoria's behavior and share my concerns about the stress this situation was putting on my new marriage. The beauty of my approach was that I never had to actively spread gossip or make accusations. I simply allowed the truth to emerge naturally through Victoria's own social network, letting her friends and acquaintances draw their own conclusions about her character and the authenticity of her family's image. Meanwhile, at home, Roberto was conducting his own investigation into Victoria's past. The DNA test results had shattered his trust completely, and he hired a private investigator to uncover the full extent of his wife's deceptions. What they discovered went far beyond a single affair. Victoria had been systematically lying to Roberto throughout their marriage about finances, relationships, and family matters. The investigator found evidence of multiple affairs over the years, secret credit card accounts, and even forged documents related to some of Roberto's business dealings. The woman Roberto had trusted with his heart, his home, and his business empire had been betraying him in ways he never could have imagined. The social consequences for Victoria were swift and brutal. Invitations to exclusive events suddenly stopped arriving. Her regular table at the country club became mysteriously unavailable. Former friends began avoiding her calls and declining her lunch invitations. In the world of Beverly Hills high society, reputation is everything, and Victoria's had been completely destroyed. But the legal consequences were even more devastating. Roberto filed for divorce within a month of receiving the DNA test results, citing adultery and fraud. His attorneys argued that Victoria had entered their marriage under false pretenses and had continued to deceive him throughout their relationship. They demanded she forfeit any claim to the Rodriguez family assets, including the homes, businesses, and investment portfolios that had been built during their marriage. Victoria tried to fight back, hiring her own team of expensive lawyers and attempting to discredit the DNA test results. She claimed that I had somehow falsified the evidence and that the entire situation was part of an elaborate scheme to turn her family against her. But her arguments fell apart when Roberto's investigator presented additional evidence of her affairs and financial deceptions. The divorce proceedings became front-page news in the local society magazines and gossip blogs. Headlines like "Rodriguez Dynasty Rocked by DNA Scandal" and "Beverly Hills Matriarch's Secret Life Exposed" appeared across social media and entertainment news websites. Victoria, who had spent decades carefully cultivating her image as the perfect wife and mother, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of living a double life. During this time, David was struggling to process the revelation that the man he had called father for 35 years was not his biological parent. We spent hours in couples therapy, working through his feelings of betrayal and confusion while also trying to protect our newborn daughter from the chaos surrounding us. I supported David completely during this difficult period, never once saying, "I told you so," or pointing out that his mother's cruelty toward me had been projection all along. Instead, I focused on helping him understand that family is defined by love and commitment, not just genetics. Roberto, despite learning that David wasn't his biological son, never wavered in his love for the man he had raised. Their relationship actually grew stronger as they navigated this crisis together. The final blow to Victoria's world came when the private investigator identified David's biological father. He was a tennis instructor at the country club where Victoria had spent so much time during the early years of her marriage. The man had since moved to Europe and had no idea that he had a son in California. When Roberto's investigator contacted him, he was initially shocked but eventually agreed to meet David if that was what David wanted. Victoria's affair hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment or a mistake during a difficult time in her marriage. She had carried on a relationship with this man for over a year, all while playing the role of the devoted wife and planning her future around Roberto's wealth and status. When this final piece of information became public, Victoria's remaining defenders abandoned her completely. Even her own sister, who had initially stood by her, admitted that the pattern of deception was too extensive to excuse or forgive. The divorce settlement was finalized 8 months after Emma's birth. Victoria was awarded a minimal amount, far less than she would have received in a normal California divorce. She lost the Beverly Hills mansion, the vacation homes, the luxury cars, and most importantly, her social standing in the community she had ruled for decades. Roberto, showing remarkable grace under pressure, made it clear that David would remain his heir and that Emma would always be his granddaughter. He had raised David as his own son for 35 years, and no DNA test was going to change that relationship. His love for our family actually deepened as he realized that David had inherited Roberto's values and character through choice and example, not just genetics. But the story doesn't end there, because Victoria's downfall revealed one more shocking secret that no one saw coming. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about this entire situation. The caller was Margaret Chen, a woman who introduced herself as a former employee of the fertility clinic where Victoria had received treatment 36 years ago. Margaret explained that she had been following the Rodriguez family scandal in the news and felt compelled to share information she had kept secret for decades. She was retiring from her medical career and wanted to clear her conscience about something she had witnessed when Victoria was trying to conceive David. What Margaret told me was so shocking that I initially didn't believe it. According to Margaret, Victoria had been having fertility problems during her marriage to Roberto. After multiple failed attempts to conceive naturally, Victoria had secretly undergone artificial insemination using donor sperm, without Roberto's knowledge or consent. She had specifically requested a donor who resembled Roberto physically, hoping to maintain the deception indefinitely. This meant that Victoria's affair with the tennis instructor had been a cover story for an even deeper deception. David's biological father wasn't her lover at all, but an anonymous sperm donor whose identity was protected by medical confidentiality laws. Victoria had spent David's entire life maintaining multiple layers of lies. She had deceived Roberto about her fertility treatments, created a false narrative about an affair to explain David's genetics, and built her family's entire identity around bloodline purity while knowing that none of it was authentic. When I shared this information with Roberto and David, their reactions were completely different from what I expected. Rather than feeling more betrayed, they seemed almost relieved. The affair story had suggested that Victoria had genuine feelings for another man, which somehow felt more hurtful than learning that she had made clinical, calculated decisions about David's conception. Roberto admitted that he had suspected fertility issues during their early marriage, but had never pursued testing because Victoria had insisted everything was fine. Learning that she had sought treatment in secret, while hurtful, at least explained why their attempts to conceive had been so difficult and lengthy. David, for his part, felt a strange sense of closure. The anonymous donor scenario meant that his conception had been about Roberto's and Victoria's desire for a child, even if the methods had been deceptive. It felt less personal than thinking his mother had chosen another man over his father during their marriage. We decided not to make this final revelation public. Victoria had already lost everything that mattered to her, and exposing this additional layer of deception wouldn't serve any purpose beyond cruelty. Sometimes revenge is knowing when to stop. Today, 3 years after that confrontation in the hospital room, our lives have settled into a beautiful new normal. David has fully embraced his role as Emma's father and Roberto's son, regardless of genetics. Emma is a happy, healthy toddler who adores her grandfather Roberto and has no idea about the drama that surrounded her birth. Roberto has become the most wonderful grandfather imaginable, spoiling Emma with love and attention while teaching David how to manage the family business empire. Their relationship is stronger now than it was before the truth came out, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than assumptions about blood relations. Victoria lives alone in a small apartment in Pasadena, her social circle reduced to virtually nothing. She has made several attempts to contact David and meet Emma, but we have maintained firm boundaries about her involvement in our lives. Until she takes full responsibility for her actions and the pain she caused, she will remain estranged from the family she destroyed through her own choices. The most unexpected outcome of this entire experience has been my relationship with Roberto. He has become not just a father-in-law, but a genuine friend and mentor. He often tells people that he gained a daughter and granddaughter when David married me, and that genetics are far less important than character when it comes to family bonds. As for the DNA test that started everything, it remains framed in Roberto's office as a reminder that truth always emerges eventually, no matter how carefully people try to bury it. He jokes that it's the most expensive piece of paper he's ever owned, considering what it cost Victoria, but also the most valuable, considering what it revealed about the importance of honesty in relationships. Looking back, I realized that Victoria's accusations about Emma's legitimacy were the greatest gift she could have given me. Her cruelty forced me to investigate her own secrets, which ultimately freed our entire family from decades of deception and manipulation. The lesson I learned through all of this is that people who are constantly suspicious of others are usually projecting their own guilty consciences. Victoria's obsession with genetics and bloodline purity came from her knowledge that her own family was built on lies. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the true meaning of family. Roberto raised David with love, patience, and wisdom for 35 years. That relationship was never dependent on shared DNA, and it didn't become less meaningful when we learned the truth about David's conception. Emma will grow up knowing that family is defined by love, commitment, and daily choices to care for one another. She'll understand that her grandfather Roberto chose to love her before she was even born, and that her father David becomes more her father every day through his actions and devotion. Sometimes the people who try hardest to destroy your happiness end up giving you exactly what you need to build something stronger. Victoria's attempt to delegitimize my daughter led to the exposure of her own illegitimate life, and ultimately brought our real family closer together. If you're dealing with someone who constantly questions your integrity or tries to undermine your place in your family, remember that their behavior often says more about their own secrets than it does about you. And if you're ever tempted to make accusations about someone else's character, make sure your own life can withstand the same level of scrutiny. Because in my experience, the truth always finds a way to surface, especially when someone is determined to uncover it. What's your experience with family members who turned out to be projecting their own guilt onto others? Have you ever discovered that someone's accusations were really confessions about their own behavior? Share your stories in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe if this story reminded you that karma sometimes needs a little help from a well-timed DNA test. The ultimate twist reveals that Victoria's affair was actually a cover story for an even deeper deception. David was conceived through secret artificial insemination with donor sperm, meaning Victoria had been living multiple layers of lies for over 35 years while obsessing over bloodline purity.